do then is just go over and have a sort of survey of the Dutch catalysis history, which you probably are most interested in. When introduce also people like Jan de Boer and Piet Corset and all these stuff, Wolfgang Sachter, all these fellows who were there of very great importance in all that time. See, I was born in Indonesia, and lived there till I was 17. I went to Holland. So I had my PhD at the University of Leiden. That incidentally is the university where now Professor Ponus is the professor in catalysis. From then on, sometime in 1937, I went to Shell. Shell at that time was just beginning its research in catalysis. It had a group working there that was connected with the IG Farben, the German IG Farben, the famous company in Germany. So they had a high pressure hydrogenation plant. And I think Exxon at the same time. Exxon, it was Esso, it was also in that pool. From then on, they got into new catalysis, and that was all aviation gasoline. Aviation gasoline for the big airplanes, of course, of that time, and also, but also of the military airplanes. They did that rather with great let's say, gusto. You know, there was a lot of power behind that effort. But it stopped in 1940, of course. And 1940 that was when the war came, and then we got to a completely different sort of situation. We were just trying to earn our own money, to keep alive. We were doing all sorts of things for the Dutch population. So you get onto all sorts of processes, making vitamin C, making phthalic anhydride out of some naphthalene, which we got from the state mines. And that, so when we just made it till the end of 1945, without getting too much involved in what the Germans were doing. From then on, you had to rebuild the whole research in, at Shell Amsterdam. There were a lot of buildings there, but there was not really anything what's going on there. And so we had the time of our life of rebuilding a new research center. And the people which we have to mention there are, for instance, one my direct head that I have, Han Hoog. He spelled it H-A-N-H-O-O-G. Han was the man who really put a lot of effort in the applied research. For instance, one thing in hydrogen desulfurization. That lasted till about, say, the beginning of the 50s, and then we split. Shell at that time said, well, let's also do a lot of fundamental research. It's so important. And that, of course, we know that already, because every field did it. So what happened then was that we were sent, so we were exchanged by the famous Emory Field Labs, and to stay there for 1 year and then come back and use all the knowledge which we had found there. And there was a lot of knowledge there. Otto Beek was one of them, D.P. Stevenson, Mirko Tamery. Those were all cracks in the field of the wartime catalysis in the United States. Whole new processes came over. Catalytic cracking came over. And not very long after that, Vladimir Hansen came with his catalytic reforming process. And that evolutionary year, 1954 or 55, was really one of the best years I ever had in my life, because also the connection with the younger people, Hans Benesi, Riley, Rayleigh, or the John Hutchins, which just made we're all in a private life and doing very interesting work at that time. Coming back then, I went to, I got from fundamental research to applied research. I was simply asked to do that. And after a couple of years, I had to have some coordination job, but that was not precisely what was in my line. So after when I got a call to go to a new university, the new technological university here in Eindhoven, I accepted that, stayed there for, became this in the university in catalysis and in inorganic chemistry. It was also a nice time. You had to start again. Nothing was there. There were new buildings were built, and you had to do all sorts of things which you didn't know how to do, actually. You had to teach. And then gradually evolved to a reasonable, let's say, plan of research. Plans were basically, let's not go into metacatalysis, because there was many people doing metacatalysis. Let's go into hydrodesulfurization, and let's go into oxidation. For some reason, oxidation had always been very fascinating to me. My PhD thesis was on oxidation, thermal oxidation. And during the war, we had done some work on transferring or converting toluene into benzaldehyde, I should say that. So there were so many problems with that thing that it just keep with me, and that was really the birth of the Eindhoven oxidation school. And then somewhere around 70, when was it, 77, I think. And before that, I had got an invitation to go to Delaware. And that was again in the line of building up a section in the Department of Chemical Engineering. That time, the chairman was Arthur Metzner. And Arthur wanted to have a whole new group of young people to get into the catalysis. I was asked to help to begin that with them, and they were very bright, and the names are now well known, of course. Bruce Gates was one of them. Jim Ketzer was another one. So yeah, that was another beautiful time. Again, it's a new start. That went on till about 1977, then when I was retired from the university here in Eindhoven, I became a research professor there at full time. And we wrote a book there together, or us three, that of course well known. We had also had to construct the whole center. Jim Kessler was first chairman, and later on, when Jim went to Mobile, Bruce Gates took over. And he introduced the whole organometallics on support research, which is now Delaware is very well known. They were still doing some work on oxidation. Well, then around 1984, I was in 74, so well, maybe that's time enough. So I had my short retirement and came back here. And that's where now talking. Well, what I would like now to talk about is what really occurred at all, I mean, in the Dutch catalysis world. Which were the people who were interested, who were on the main, who put a lot of effort into it. And it has to be stressed from the very beginning that just the same way as it happened in the United States, it was great industries. People there, let's say, as Shell and Esso, not to forget, the Mobil, who really made the new chemistry. And we followed that same pattern. There was one point that was sort of typical for the Dutch catalyst. And that point was the relation we had with the Philips electronic industry. Philips was probably the first big industry in the Netherlands and had a full-blown research lab here in Eindhoven. And they had a lot of people, I mean, their selection of people was of such great value. People like, for instance, Jan de Boer was there. He had Evert van Wey was there. And they built up a solid state chemistry that we from then on introduced in Shell, but sometimes also at the university. But that came later. The other factor, the great factor in the Netherlands was the existence of the Dutch state mine. The Dutch state mines was at that time still a real coal exploitation firm, but somewhere in the 60s they changed from coal over to petroleum as a basis, and all the mines are closed. So although the name DSM, which means Dutch state mines, is still there, and they still have that DSM name there, there are no mines at all. I mean, it's just a big petrochemical separate company. Our research at that time was then typically happening in Holland at Shell, also the fundamental research, and at the state mines. And let me mention some names there. Again, Han Hoog was there. Then you had some new people, like, for instance, one was Wolfgang Sachtler. Wolfgang came in the beginning of the 50s. And I'm always proud that I found him, that I brought him over to the Netherlands.
How did you find him?
At the Congress. He was at the first catalysis Congress at the Gothenburg. It was not catalysis Congress, it was a solid state Congress, when Hatfall was still there. And we came with some solid state stuff from Amsterdam, and there was a young man from Germany who gave an excellent lecture. And that I have to have that. Although it was very difficult, because at that time Germans were definitely not very popular. But that went all rather nicely, and so Wolfgang came in 6 weeks. he mastered a good enough knowledge of the Dutch language. He's really one of the top, he's a very good feeling for languages. So that he gradually evolved there as one of the top people we had in the let's say, scientific catalysis work. There was another young man there, Picosset. You spell that Pete, of course, but then you get C-O-S-S-E-E. And Pete's name became known all over the world by his theory of the mechanism of the Ziegler-Natta reaction. And even now, that's still one of the best accepted theories. There have been changes, of course. I mean, the whole Ziegler-Natta process is evolving a lot. But he was then the man who really led the basis for the consistent theory on the basis of inorganic chemistry, solid inorganic chemistry. And where did they get that thing? Pete came from a professor called Van Arkel, who was a professor at, of course, in Leiden. Another professor who came in, and that's over, he was he originally came from the Philips research lab. The other very interesting man was Jan de Boer. His career is fascinating. He was one of the first to get into the solid surfaces of the solid state. Typically, of course, because they were working on electronic vacuum tubes and all that sort of thing. When the war started, when the Germans came into in Holland, he was actually in military service. He was one of the top people who did. He was advising the government on new and let's say dangerous things which could happen in war. And de Boer then was one of the few people who could escape to Britain. So then Jan de Boer, who had written already a very interesting book on the surfaces of solids. And if you are interested, I could give you a copy of his book before 1945. It's upstairs. I'll bring it to you. And it's still at the time it was fascinating. In all ways, it was a book. That was a new direction. That's what we offer to be the new direction. When Jan de Boer came back, he didn't return to the Philips company, but he was at that time with Unilever. He also became a part-time professor at Delft, at the Delft University, which at that time, in the beginning of the 50s, was the only one we had. And he was an advisor of the Dutch state mine. So now you see what happened was that the shell fundamentally certain catalysis and the Dutch state mines, the university catalysis work, was all actually under the influence in one way or another by what happened in the fundamental research on solids in the years between 1940 and 1955. So. And that's the typical character of the Dutch catalysis research. In some way or another, we all had sort of an influence of either Professor what's his name, Van Arkel or de Boer, who always had been connected because they wrote even a book together. Well, Jan de Boer was also developed his own school at Delft. And just to mention a few people who came from that school, I would say Koenen, Sjaak Koenen, who later went to Unilever, and from then on became a professor in Nijmegen. Also there were Linsen, and especially, what's his name? The man who did, I'll bring that back in a moment, I'll have to look that up. But it was the man who did the work on the structure of aluminum oxide. Lipids, batteries. And so that, around 1955, there were three centers. De Boer in Delft, rather closely connected with the Dutch state mines. In the Dutch state mines, you had people like Zwietering, which are always Jos Scholten, were coming from elsewhere, from Amsterdam, and Piet Zwietering was even came right from the industry. And Shell, that was the group Sachter, and which were my group, Sachter, Picosse, and so on. Now life began, of course. De Boer was the man who was behind, was the final man, the first man who put in the Dutch, made a sort of illustration of why that thing, apparently, that the whole research seems to do something that is interesting to the outer world, because the third International Congress of Catalysis was in Amsterdam in 1964. And it's more or less, I mean, that you will find in the names also Han Hoog, Piet Cossé, and of course the American people. Alex Mills was there. So in my feeling, that was probably one of the top times of the Dutch catalysis.
How did De Boer get established in the international circle of catalysis?
Oh yeah, well he was, mainly this was true that because of that book. Sir Eric Radil had, for instance, had just pushed him to writing that book. So that's because we want to know what's in the oxidation, and in the whole solid state heterogeneous catalysis. And you haven't made a good introduction. Although De Boer didn't know anything about catalysis at all at that time. But he was one, and then when he went into Unilever in the Netherlands, then of course then catalysis came to the fore, right? There was the margarine, the nickel on alumina, and on the silicate catalyst, the Gour catalyst. That was interesting, and that, so he became familiar with that. He developed methods from his own old story of how to do that on that things like metals like tungsten, where you can put in sodium atoms or so. He had a very good feeling for what really is now surface science.
And who was instrumental in starting the movement to have the Amsterdam meeting in Amsterdam?
You mean between Amsterdam and the Dutch state mines?
No, the International Congress on Catalysis.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's really a joint effort of the three. Typically, there was the two main factors were Shell and the Dutch state mine, and De Boer was on any place. because he was an advisor of the state mines. He had his own labs in at the University of Delaware, of the University of Delft. So he was, without any doubt, he was a leading man. Not, of course, that everybody would at that time, but we would agree to that easily. But no, and in hindsight, there is no question that he was one, but he was certainly one of he was the leading man at the time. Well, that went on, and at that moment the government decided to put in a number of new universities, technical universities. One was in Eindhoven, the other one was later on it came in Twente. And that's now the second typically characteristic of the Dutch, of the whole Dutch high school or university exponent in the chemistry, that about almost 50% of those people came from Shell, came from the Dutch state mine, came from Unilever. It's almost a tradition here. Let me tell you now, for instance, the Eindhoven school, I was first, I came from Shell. My successor was Prins, Roer Prins, came from Shell. The man who's come now here is Rutger van Santen, came from Shell. You know that Prins went to Zurich. And so he's now, he accepted the full professorship at the Zurich University. Which we think, I think it's a very great loss to us. Very great. Prince really was one of the top people we could find. Rutger van Santen is probably the only one who could replace him now. But then, what happened in Twente, there also we had people from industry, so the Van Zwaay, for instance, the chemical engineer there. Then we had a famous name which everybody knows in catalysis, that's Piet Mars. Piet Mars came from the Dutch state mine. Van Greveland, that is the second thing, of course, was in the state, the Dutch state mine. And then went over to Axo company. And he was one of the directors of Axo. And he was again one of the part-time professors in Delft. Piet Mars went from the state mine to Twente. So the population of the Dutch universities, the technical university, was largely done by the coming from the industry and getting into the teaching and universities. It comes certainly sort of a generation later, the research at the universities.
This is much different than most countries. How did this arise in the Netherlands?
It's more or less a question, I think it was stimulated by the war. The whole idea of was that we have to work hard, we have to be quick, and we have to put in all our intellect what we can in educating young people. So there was a great pressure from the industry to on some of their people to go into the university.
But how does industry attract these people who spend some time there and then go on to universities and do so well?
And what they do then, of course, is get the new young men from those people. You see? That was what happened. I mean, it was in the 60s, there was quite a competition. A competition for the top young students. There was so much going on, everything went so much, I mean, 50s and 60s went so well. that there was quite a competition between the Dutch state mines and Shell and Unilever and Oxo for the top students. So if you could get one of your professors in there, you were one step forward, right? And that didn't always work because I mean quite a few of my students went to Philips, for instance. But in a way, it was you had always had a very good. There was always a very good contact. Also, the contact was on the other side was a question of being aware, of trying to be aware of what happened in the catalysis world, and then at least get some parallel in the university. Universities are always slower. They have to teach and you have to organize things on a teaching side. So it means that you have to take care of all sort of, even political, at a certain moment, the 70s came in, right? And then the complete democracy, introducing of democracy in the university was I wouldn't say a step forward. In fact, I didn't like it at all.
How did that hinder universities?
Well, you were the whole time you were just discussing all sort of little things with the whole staff, including the secretary, including the boy who was taking care of these chemicals. So everybody was therein. Everybody had to talk for them. And they drove. There was a lot of time lost. So starting around 1968, that was when the things went through a crisis. A crisis also in the sense that for some reasons or another, these darn students didn't want to go to the industry. They wanted to teach, but no connection whatsoever with money. Money was something that was nice. It was not nice. You shouldn't touch money. You shouldn't have these big salaries and so on.
How do you think De Boer would have reacted had he been teaching at that time?
Well, De Boer probably just, and that was very unfortunately. He died when he was 72. He had already left the university, and when it happened, then, well, the story is tragic. He went out walking his dog in the evening, and apparently got a stroke. And what happened was he couldn't find his way back, so he had been walking through the town the whole night, some way or another. And he finally landed up on the beach. So that's where I found him the next day. So this was really one of the real tragic events in Dutch catalysis. And that was just about before the democratization came. So luckily that he was saved from that. But he was still, at that time, was the typically first man in Dutch catalysis. There's a lot of young people going on there. And there was another one who, that's of course, which we were so very lucky with. At that time, there was the Czech invasion. So that's the time when Vladimir Podek came. Vladimir was taken good care of by Wolf Sachtler. Wolf at that time was also assistant and was also a part-time professor at Leiden. But the university, the Shell was just putting the pressure on him that he should come back. He had to choose either full professor at Leiden or going back to Shell. And at that time, Vladimir came in. And he was, besides the demand, man cultured, very nice, very pleasant, good knowledge, within half a year, good knowledge of the Dutch language. Also, a very charming wife who did very good work in medical chemistry. So there we are very well settled in Ireland, and it's wonderful to be with Vladimir. He's really, at the moment, he's the outstanding professor. He and Prince were the two outstanding professors, and now Prince is gone. He was the only one that was left there. Luckily, the rest of consultants has finally, after lots of pressure, has accepted. So the time for catalysis hasn't been that easy. And, firstly, of course, it has lost some of its great attraction. And there is still a lot of interesting things, of course, there. But there's no anymore. I mean, people are now all for Seawright. Seawright is taking a lot of information. I mean, you must be aware of it, because you have a lot of that went out from the astronauts, from Oval and so. It's still very interesting, but it is not so much news coming out. There's a lot of effort still on the CO hydrogenation, but it gets sort of a feeling of old stuff. People like the Shell people more left it. They were, of course, in the synthesis gas with coppers, and they had a pilot better, but the main effort is now in Seawright. Well then, the next thing is what made life difficult was that the new policy, financial policy of the new government, we put in so much money in, let's say, the 14% of unemployed here. There has to be a very strict economy now, which means that money is going to science is rather curtailed. One of the reasons why Prince went to Zurich, because he could simply get more money there. And it is now, I would say, catalysis is now a settled business. There's a lot of things going on, but it hasn't got that enormous elan new things that were being found. Catalytic cracking, catalytic reforming, Granata and so on, in the 40s, and the 50s, and the 60s. So it's now more stabilized and necessary, but not anymore that attractive field of something between magic and the science. And maybe it could be more science out of it.
Do you think that the reason it's sort of become stable or stagnant is because industry has become somewhat conservative during this period?
In a way it has, yeah. I mean, what you're really feeling now is that the lack of input from the great industries on the scientific side, industry has become more sparsely with information. Right? There are still some good things, but now look at DuPont. DuPont had an enormous effort in catalysis. And quite a selected number of good scientists, Arthur Slade, for instance. I just mentioned one of them, Will Lynn, but there are lots of these. Now what they are doing now, catalysis is going down. It's now biotechnology, but more composites, inorganic composites. So Arthur Slade out of that, the old selective catalysis side is being closed down. And there are a lot of catalysis that are going on, of course, at the semi labs, but the fundamental research has suffered very badly. And that's on all sides. If Monsanto has it, Shell here is still holding very well, I see. But they are still have a tendency to be not so open, less, somewhat more secretive. Competition is really very, very difficult between the companies themselves. They want that lot of information that we did 10 years ago. And the other thing is, maybe that's one of the, let's say, one of the errors we made as professors. We always have been telling everybody, now, we are going to do the science of television. And then you've got a lot of things going to happen after that. Actually, of course, what actually happened was that still the industry was finding these things just by empirical means, and afterwards we tried our best to explain it. And that, of course, has at a certain time has had repercussions. It's still, I personally, I believe that it's not completely right. I mean, because the position of the industry. It's right that we are not going to make the inventions at the university, but it's we are making so much. I mean, we are gradually developing the whole understanding of catalysis. So much, people like Gates, Sachter, Somoliai, the boys in Iowa State, this is Glenn Schrader, that there is a preparation for a new inventions that can be, but again, they have to be made by the industry. We are not very much aware of what are the problems.
Well, to go back to Emeryville,
Yes.
Before 1940, was there interaction between the Netherlands and Emeryville?
Yes, very much.
And what was it that permitted Emeryville to develop such a strong scientific basis?
The war. Simply meaning the enormous pressure on aviation gasoline, for instance. All these. I'll tell you a story. When we once were when we were already under the German occupation, Shell Labs had a fellow who keep this under control. I mean, we had to tell him everything we did. And happily enough, this was a fellow who didn't believe in the national, believe Nazi. He had been an officer in the First World War and had to make his way back from Russia, back all the way to Germany by walking. A man called Zerbe, Professor Zerbe, Zerbe. And he screamed us off. He didn't mean, he was not only he kept us under control, but he also screamed us off. Now, one morning, there was one of these many attacks by the American bombers on Amsterdam. And we always had to go back to the how do you call it, the places where you have
bomb shelter?
Bomb shelters. And he was saying to us, that's all you did, pointing out the bombers that came in. You made that possible, and you were the research on aviation gasoline. very typical, of course, and the Germans were behind this. They didn't have that high octane. They used, for the U-88, the Junkers 88, was in diesel. So their performances were always below that of the Allied at that time.
Well, did Emeryville sort of take over the research arm of?
We were well parallel, Amsterdam and Emeryville at that time. Both we both were trying to isomerize butane to normal butane to isobutane. Why? Because we had alkylation, right? So that went just back and forth. I mean, my first thing was what I had to do was summarizing normal butane with aluminum chloride. And in fact, in 1939, there was a pilot plant standing there at the furnace plant. We made a ton of isobutane per day. So we were very proud of that. But then Germans came and everything was just closed. And it's an interesting point is that all the reports in Amsterdam were burned the 14th of May. We threw them all in the burning gas oil tank.
Who burned them?
We did.
The Shell.
Yeah, Shell.
Did you work with Bake on
Yeah,
acidity isomerization?
I was working with, but that was later on, of course. I was at that time. Merck Tammany was still there, and Otto Beek wasn't still there. There were people like, I can't find the name, but there were different names. After the war, they were all pensioned or retired. So Beek came later, and also Marco Tammany came later. Marco Tammany, Merck Tammany was of course a man who did a lot of on the cracking catalyst. I found that aluminum oxide, aluminum was important, right? But again, the people who found they were wrestled. Because the first catalyst, the first charges of the fluid bed catalyst in the United States were what everybody saw was silica. And it was Merck Tammany who found that it was the traces of aluminum ores, and that was very important. So Merck had a very nice insight in acid catalyst. Beek, of course, was top man in metals, because it could give you any sort of an idea of how far things were going. But nobody of the two ever thought about combining these things like Vladimir Hensel did.
Did you know Otto Bake?
Yeah.
How would you describe him as a person?
Very lively man, very lively. Was a very handsome man, young and enthusiastic. Also, his collaborators were 100% pro Otto, and he was really one of the most interesting. He was something like the Boer. He died earlier, but what he did before that time was very very interesting. But they had a similar something, the possibility to make inventions and at the same time do interesting work on the surface side.
Is there a common characteristic that permits one to do this, or is it just each one does it their own way?
No, I don't know. I mean, it's no. There are people that certainly for instance, Ziegler was one of the others. I mean, he had, of course, you have to have luck if you are a good inventor. Right? For instance, Ziegler found this process because his autoclaves were not clean. You know, and there happened to be some titanium chloride in it. But the good inventors, I mean, doesn't throw the thing away as being unscientific. They conclude from that point that there is something interesting there, something in that maybe that they haven't really done well, very well, but something that's also very interesting. And both Big and Big had it, but also the Boer had it.
But it's not something easily defined.
No, no, no. It's in more of, well, to usually say it's sort of between Langmuir and what's the famous inventor in the United States.
Edison?
Edison, yeah. Edison and
How would you describe Tamale?
basically as a scientist, and typically a capillary chemist, a colloid chemist. He was a colloid chemist from the school of his Czech school before the war. And that science was the most important point. The man whom I always found difficult to place was Stevenson, B.P. Stevenson. He had a sort of, well, he was always pushing people, and he had a sort of feeling of superiority. But it were his young people like John Hutchins, and so who really did the interesting work, I think.
Did you know Wheeler?
Yes, just like, yeah. Well, Albert Wheeler, of course, he was a genius. But unfortunately, he also was, let's say, a sort of fellow who always been drank too much and had to do liking life and so on. And he got himself into early terrible trouble, but there was great loss. Albert is, in my feeling, was one of the most interesting fellows in chemical engineering.
And how did he come to leave Shell and go to DuPont, or is that?
Yeah, he just got into trouble with his surrounding with Stevens and all, because he didn't turn up. Sometimes he had been on some sort of trip through dark San Francisco, and he drank too much, and later on he suddenly, you could never reckon on him.
Do you think that he did much of what became the theory of diffusion while he was at Shell?
Yeah.
Then,
that was that.
Who finally caused him to put it into writing, or do you not?
That must have been probably one of the Shell chemical engineers. I don't know which one the priest at that time was. But there was a different group. Maybe Huffy Foch, I don't know. But it was already there. When I came there, it was already there. And Wheeler was gone. I mean, now it was just gone.
You said Emeryville was especially attractive to you. What do you recall that made it that way?
Well, firstly, of course, I mean, the whole atmosphere of San Francisco, right? It was a nice place to live, wonderful place to live. There was, at that time, there was no smoke and all these boys had done a lot of work during the war times. Hans Benessy had been with Merkel family in his acid catalysis. Huffy Foch had been at one point and another point. He was a bit of a loner, Huffy.
Whom?
Huffy Foch. But a very serious, and very hard-working man.
Did you know Greensfelder?
Yeah, another one of these.
How would you describe him?
He was a loner. He was not very accessible. He was sort of keeping you at a distance. Some sort of a feeling of being, of distrust, that maybe you would steal things. On the other hand, also a very lone man. I mean, we were great friends, but it was very difficult for him to get. There was showing you with trains. They was always having trains down below his house. Yeah, it was their force, but was rather unlucky. So he was basically I had a lot of enemies, and my feeling, just because of these characteristic of arrogance and inaccessibility.
Who would you consider started the scientific work on catalytic cracking at Emeryville?
That was Margaret Emery.
Emery?
Yeah, Emery.
Oh.
Yeah. There was later follow-up, and it's in Emeryville already. But Emeryville already had moved over to. Emery was gone and so on by the Dutch group, and one of these fellows is called Brouwer, Brouwer, with this beautiful work on it. But he didn't want to work on heterogeneous catalysis. He wanted to do with homogeneous, like the superacids, right? He was also in my group for the short. Shall we, let's see what Eva is going to do, and see whether we can have sort of
Okay. My name is Alex Mills, and at the beginning I was born in 1914 in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada. Like a lot of individuals, my interest in chemistry was sparked by a teacher in high school.